Here on our channel, people's stories come to life. Stories from different eras, professions, and destinies. Each of them follows their own path, their own life woven from circumstances, challenges, and choices. Before we step into their world, make sure to subscribe, and later, share your impressions in the comments. Now, let's begin. Some stories don't start with loud events. They start small, with details, with moments that seem insignificant, yet hold entire worlds within them. These are stories about people who never chose to be heroes. They simply lived, worked, made mistakes, learned from them, and kept moving forward. The lives of such people unfold like a slowly blooming flower, each petal revealing itself in its own time, each layer hiding new secrets, new pains, new joys. This is a story from a time when the world was just a little different. The boy learned about death before he learned his letters. His mother slipped away in the winter of 1842, when the ice formed thick along the harbor and the fishing boats sat locked in frozen silence. She coughed herself thin through December, and by January she was gone. The father, a man whose hands smelled permanently of cod and salt, said little about it. There were nets to mend. There was always work. The village clung to the Maine coast like a barnacle to rock. Wooden houses weathered gray, smoke rising from chimneys, the constant sound of water against stone. Everyone knew everyone's business, and everyone's business was survival. The boy understood this early. You worked or you starved. You kept your head down around the customs men and the merchants who controlled the docks. You trusted family, though even that was a gamble. He was 8 when the old lighthouse keeper found him sitting on the breakwater, throwing stones at nothing in particular. "You planning to knock down the ocean one rock at a time?" The boy looked up. The keeper was ancient, at least 40, with a beard gone mostly white and eyes that seemed permanently narrowed against wind. "Just sitting." "Sitting's fine. Thinking's better. You any good with your hands?" The boy shrugged. He could tie knots, he could gut a fish without wasting meat. Beyond that, who knew? "Come up to the light tomorrow morning, early. I'll see if you're worth teaching." The keeper walked away before the boy could ask what he meant. The lighthouse stood on a promontory north of the village, a white tower that caught the first sun and the last. 52 steps to the top, the boy counted them that first morning, his legs burning. The keeper was already there, tending the great lamp with movements so practiced they looked like ritual. "This here burns sperm oil. Costs the government $7 a gallon, so you don't waste a drop. You clean the lens every morning. You trim the wick, just so. You keep the logbook honest, weather, ships past, anything unusual. And you keep the light burning no matter what." The boy nodded, though he understood perhaps half of it. "Why me?" The keeper shrugged. "You look like you needed somewhere to be." It was true, though the boy had not known it himself. The work was endless and precise. The brass fixtures needed polishing until they gleamed. The lens, a marvel of curved glass imported from France, required cleaning with specific cloths and particular care. The keeper demonstrated once, then watched as the boy tried, correcting with a grunt or a nod. Words were spare, instructions were clear. "You're not stupid," the keeper said one afternoon, which felt like high praise. The boy, learning, discovered that the lighthouse had its own rhythm, separate from the chaos of the village. The lamp lighting at dusk, the watch through the night, the extinguishing at dawn. Recording the temperature, the wind direction, the state of the sea. It was repetitive, but repetition brought a kind of peace. Up here, no one asked about his mother or whether his father was drinking away the fishing money. By age 12, he was practically living at the lighthouse, sleeping in the small keeper's quarters more often than in his father's cold house. The keeper never commented on this, just left an extra blanket folded on the cot. The sea taught its lessons through violence. In his 13th year, a schooner broke apart on the rocks during an October gale. The boy and the keeper launched the small rescue boat, fought through waves that seemed intent on swallowing them whole. They saved 3 sailors. 5 others drowned. Their bodies recovered over the following week. The boy learned that you could do everything right and still fail, that the ocean had no opinions about fairness or effort, that death was a constant neighbor along this coast, sometimes quiet, sometimes screaming. He developed a humor about it, dark, dry, a way of keeping the horror at arm's length. When the keeper asked if he was all right after pulling a drowned child from the surf, the boy said, "Well, I'm still breathing, which puts me ahead." The keeper gave him a long look, then nodded. He understood. The customs officials came periodically to inspect the lighthouse, officials who wore clean coats and spoke with Boston accents. The keeper was always polite, always careful, always showed them exactly what they asked to see and nothing more. "Why do you act different around them?" the boy asked once. "Because they have power and we don't. Remember that. Men with authority are not your friends, even when they smile." This lesson sank deep. But the keeper was also careless in one way. He trusted too easily those who showed him personal kindness. When merchants offered him discounted oil or supplies, he accepted without question. When villagers asked small favors, could a message be relayed? Could a package be stored? He obliged freely. The boy noticed this contradiction, but said nothing. Everyone had their blind spots. The years passed in the rhythm of seasons. Summer brought thick fogs that turned the world into gray mystery. Fall brought storms that tested every seal and bolt in the lighthouse structure. Winter brought ice and darkness and the particular loneliness of long nights. Spring brought relief and mud and the return of shipping traffic. The boy grew tall and capable. His hands became as practiced as the keeper's had been, cleaning the lens without thinking, trimming the wick to the precise length, recording observations in neat script. He learned to predict weather by the color of the sky at sunset, the behavior of seabirds, the smell of the wind. He learned which ship captains were competent and which were reckless. He learned that most accidents were preventable, and that prevented accidents earned no gratitude, because no one knew they had been avoided. By 17, he was no longer a boy, though the village still thought of him as the keeper's odd apprentice. His father had died 2 winters prior, quietly in his sleep, pickled enough by drink that the cold probably did not bother him much. The boy felt less than he expected to feel. Some connections fray before they break. The old keeper was slowing down. His hands shook slightly when he filled the oil reservoir. He took the stairs more carefully, pausing at the landing to catch his breath. "You'll have this place to yourself before long," he said one evening, as they shared bread and cheese while watching the sunset paint the water copper and gold. "Don't talk like that." "Talking like that or not doesn't change what's coming. I've taught you everything I know. You'll do fine. Better than fine." You actually care about the work, not just the wage. The wage was modest. $40 a month from the federal government, plus quarters and an allowance for oil and supplies. Enough to live simply. Enough to save a little, if you were careful. "Just remember," the keeper added, "the light matters more than you do, more than anyone does. That's the job." The apprentice, who would soon be something else, looked out at the darkening sea and understood completely. The light was the constant. People came and went. Ships sailed and sank. Storms raged and calmed. But the light continued, cutting through darkness and fog, indifferent and essential. He was ready. The old keeper died on a Tuesday in March, which seemed appropriate somehow. Mid-week, mid-month, nothing dramatic about it. He simply did not wake up. The new keeper found him in the morning, lying peacefully in his cot, hands folded across his chest, as if he had arranged himself for the occasion. There was paperwork, of course. A federal employee dying required forms and inspections, and a replacement appointed through proper channels. The lighthouse service sent a temporary keeper for 2 weeks while they processed everything. A nervous man from Portsmouth who jumped at every sound and checked the lamp 3 times each evening. Then the appointment came through. The position was his. He was 18 years old and responsible for keeping ships from crashing into the Maine coast. The weight of it settled onto his shoulders like a familiar coat. The funeral was small, a dozen villagers, the minister rushing through prayers because the wind was bitter and everyone wanted to get inside. They buried the old keeper in the hillside cemetery overlooking the water, which felt right. The new keeper stood apart from the others, hat in hand, saying his own private words. The dead man had been more father than teacher, though neither of them would have said so aloud. Afterward, he walked back to the lighthouse alone. His lighthouse now. The thought was strange and steadying at once. The rhythm of the work remained unchanged, which helped. Wake before dawn, extinguish and clean the lamp, record the night's observations, check the weather, inspect the tower and outbuildings, maintain the equipment, light the lamp at dusk, keep watch through darkness. The days built themselves from routine, and routine kept the loneliness at bay. Mostly. He was 19 when Sarah started appearing at the supply dock when he came to town for provisions. She worked in her father's chandlery, a slim girl with dark hair and capable hands that could splice rope as neatly as any sailor. They talked while he loaded lamp oil and wick material and cleaning supplies onto his cart. "Don't you get lonely up there?" she asked one afternoon. "I've got the gulls for company. They're terrible conversationalists, but they're honest." She laughed. He liked making her laugh. The courtship, such as it was, consisted of these brief encounters and occasional walks along the harbor when his duties allowed. She was practical and clever, with no illusions about the hardships of lighthouse keeping. He began to imagine a future that included another person in the keeper's quarters, meals shared, conversation in the evenings. He should have known better. Sarah married a merchant's son the following spring, a young man with clean hands and prospects, whose father owned 2 ships and a warehouse. The keeper heard about it third hand, from the harbor master's assistant, who delivered supplies when the regular man was sick. "Shame about Sarah Wendell," the assistant said, not unkindly, "but I suppose a girl's got to think practical." The keeper nodded and said nothing. What was there to say? She had thought practical. A lighthouse keeper's wage was steady but modest. A merchant's son could offer a proper house, security, perhaps even comfort. He did not blame her. He simply folded the disappointment away and got back to work. The loneliness was sharper after that, but it faded. Everything faded given time. He settled into his 20s with the resignation of someone who had accepted his place in the world. The lighthouse defined his existence. The village saw him as reliable but odd, a man who chose isolation, who seemed content with the company of sea and stone. He cultivated this reputation deliberately. It kept people from asking too many questions or expecting too much conversation. He did develop a few cautious connections. Thomas Weatherby, a merchant who imported textiles and hardware, sometimes stopped by the lighthouse when conducting business up the coast. Weatherby was perhaps 40, well-dressed but not ostentatious, with a manner that suggested he had earned his position through work rather than inheritance. "You keep excellent records," Weatherby said once, paging through the lighthouse log. "Most keepers just scratch down the minimum." "The minimum doesn't help anyone." "No, it doesn't." They talked sometimes about shipping routes, weather patterns, the quality of various lamp oils. Weatherby treated him as an equal, which was unusual. Most merchants regarded lighthouse keepers as glorified servants. The keeper appreciated this and let his guard down slightly. Not much, but enough to consider Weatherby something approaching a friend. The harbor master, Gideon Pierce, was another regular presence. Pierce was a large man who moved with surprising grace, always impeccably dressed, with a voice that carried authority. He had held his position for 15 years and knew every captain, every cargo, every irregularity along this stretch of coast. "Fine work keeping that light burning through last week's blow," Pierce would say, clapping him on the shoulder. "The Coastal Service depends on men like you." The keeper accepted these compliments with polite nods, never quite comfortable with Pierce, but seeing no reason to distrust him. Pierce was the authority. You respected authority, kept your distance, and did your job. The years accumulated like sand in an hourglass. 20 became 25, became 29. He saved his wages carefully, living simply, needing little. His possessions fit in a single trunk, spare clothes, a few books bought used, the pocket watch the old keeper had left him, tools for minor repairs. He owned nothing of value except his skill and his reputation for reliability. Sometimes during the long night watches, he wondered if this was all his life would be. The same tower, the same tasks, the same solitary existence, until he was the old man training some new apprentice. The thought did not depress him exactly. There was dignity in the work, purpose. But there was also a creeping sense of time passing while he stood still. A lighthouse, fixed in place while the world moved around it. He noticed things, though, small things that nagged at the edges of his attention. Ships passing at unusual hours, running without lights, boats anchoring in coves that offered no shelter or obvious purpose. Cargo manifests that did not quite match what he observed being loaded and unloaded when he visited the village. These inconsistencies floated through his mind like fog, never quite solid enough to grasp. Once, he mentioned to Pierce that he had seen a sloop anchored in the North Cove 3 nights running, showing no lights. "Probably sheltering from the weather," Pierce said easily. "Nothing to worry about." The keeper nodded and let it go. Pierce would know. It was his job to know. The autumn he turned 30 arrived with spectacular violence. September storms battered the coast, each one stronger than the last. He reinforced the shutters, checked every seal and bolt, laid in extra supplies. The lighthouse had weathered 100 years of storms. It would weather these. But November brought something different, a storm that felt personal in its fury, that screamed around the tower like something alive and angry. He spent 2 days barely sleeping, monitoring the lamp, watching for ships in distress, feeling the entire structure shudder under the wind's assault. When it finally passed and dawn broke clear and cold, he descended to inspect for damage. The world was scoured clean, debris scattered across the rocks, seaweed draped over everything like garlands. And there, wedged between two boulders at the tide line, was Thomas Weatherby's body. The keeper stood very still, rain dripping from his coat, and felt something shift in the foundation of his carefully ordered world. He recognized the clothes, the build, even from a distance. He approached slowly, hope fading with each step. Weatherby lay face down, arms at odd angles, seaweed tangled in his hair. Drowned, obviously. A man caught by the storm, swept overboard, tragic but not uncommon. Except... The keeper crouched down, professional instinct overriding shock. He noted details without thinking about why. The bruising on Weatherby's wrists, dark against pale skin. The missing signet ring that Weatherby always wore. The keeper had seen it 100 times. The way the body was positioned, as if it had not simply washed ashore, but been placed. He told himself he was imagining things, reading meaning into randomness. The sea did strange things to bodies and belongings, but the doubt, once planted, began to grow. He reported the death to Pierce, who arrived with the sheriff and a doctor. They examined the body briefly, asked a few questions, and declared it an accidental drowning, a terrible tragedy. These things happened during storms. The investigation, such as it was, lasted perhaps an hour. "Best not to dwell on it," Pierce said, his hand heavy on the keeper's shoulder. "You did your duty reporting it. Let us handle the rest." The keeper nodded obediently. But that night, in his logbook, he wrote a detailed description of everything he had observed. The bruises, the missing ring, the position of the body. He dated it, signed it, and closed the book. Something was wrong. He did not know what yet, but he had learned long ago that the truth mattered, even when, especially when, no one else seemed interested in finding it. Winter settled over the coast like a heavy quilt, smothering everything in cold and gray silence. The keeper went about his duties with mechanical precision, but Weatherby's death had left a splinter in his mind that he could not extract. He told himself to let it alone. The authorities had investigated. The matter was closed. A man drowned in a storm. Tragic, common, unremarkable. Except it was remarkable, in small ways that accumulated like snow. He could not stop thinking about those bruises on the wrists. Dark, circular, the kind made by rope or hands gripping hard. He had seen enough drowned sailors to know what storm damage looked like. Random contusions, scrapes from rocks, the general battering of a body thrown against hard surfaces. These marks were different, deliberate. And the missing ring. Weatherby had worn that signet ring every single day, a thick gold band with his family crest. The keeper had noticed it specifically because Weatherby gestured often when he talked, and the ring caught the light. It would not have simply slipped off. Gold was soft, yes, but that ring had fit snugly. He mentioned none of this to anyone. The old keeper's voice echoed in his memory. "Men with authority are not your friends." Pierce had closed the investigation quickly, too quickly, perhaps. The sheriff had seemed eager to agree with whatever Pierce suggested. Even the doctor had barely examined the body before pronouncing his verdict. The keeper understood his position. He was a federal employee, yes, but a minor one. A lighthouse keeper's opinion on matters of local law enforcement meant precisely nothing. Worse than nothing, it would be seen as overstepping, as a solitary man inventing drama to feel important. So he kept his mouth shut and his eyes open. In December, he made his regular trip to the village for supplies. Margaret, who ran the general store, was arranging jars of preserves when he entered. "Sad business about Mr. Weatherby," she said, not looking up. "His poor wife, left with 3 children and debts no one knew about." The keeper paused in examining lamp wicks. "Debts? Oh, yes. Apparently the textile business wasn't doing as well as people thought. He owed money to several merchants in Portland. The widow's having to sell the house." This was new information. Weatherby had never seemed financially troubled. His clothes were quality, his manner confident. Of course, appearances could deceive. The keeper knew this better than most. Did he have business troubles with anyone local? Margaret glanced at him, something cautious entering her expression. "Why do you ask?" "Just curious. He seemed successful when I talked to him." "Well, I wouldn't know about his private affairs. That's not my place to say." She turned away, busying herself with unnecessary tasks. The keeper recognized a conversation being ended. He paid for his supplies and left, but the exchange troubled him. Margaret loved gossip, thrived on it. Her sudden discretion suggested someone had told the village to stop talking about Weatherby's death. Back at the lighthouse, he spent the long winter evenings reviewing his memory of every conversation with Weatherby. The merchant had been careful in his speech, never specific about certain details, but he had mentioned once, almost casually, that shipping manifests sometimes contained interesting discrepancies. "You'd be surprised what gets recorded as one thing and turns out to be another," Weatherby had said, with a smile that suggested he found the whole business amusing. At the time, the keeper had assumed he meant honest mistakes. Now, he wondered. January brought ice and bitter winds. The keeper chipped frozen spray from the gallery railing, maintained the lamp through nights so cold the oil thickened. Deputy Ellis came by one afternoon with a letter from the lighthouse service, routine correspondence about supply budgets. Ellis was young, maybe 25, with an earnest face and nervous hands. "Hell of a place to live," Ellis said, looking around at the ice-sheathed rocks. "Doesn't it drive you mad, being alone?" "You get used to it. The quiet's better than most conversation." Ellis laughed uncertainly. "I suppose that's true enough." He hesitated, then added, "You knew Mr. Weatherby, didn't you? I heard you two talked sometimes." "Sometimes? Why?" "No reason, just—" "The sheriff told me to note down anyone who had regular contact with him, for the records." The keeper felt something cold that had nothing to do with the weather. "There's not much to note. He stopped by occasionally when he had business up the coast. We talked about weather and shipping." "Right, of course." Ellis shifted his weight. "The thing is, his widow found some papers, letters he'd been writing to someone in Portland, about irregularities in cargo shipments through our harbor. The sheriff says it's just business nonsense, nothing important." "Probably is." But Ellis was looking at him with an expression that suggested he did not entirely believe what the sheriff was saying. The deputy left shortly after, and the keeper stood on the gallery watching him pick his way back along the icy path to shore, a small figure against the vast gray landscape. That night he could not sleep. He lay in his cot listening to the wind and thinking about irregularities in cargo shipments. About Weatherby's debts. About bruises on wrists and missing rings. About investigations closed too quickly by men who had power and wanted to keep it. In February, he found the letter fragment. It was wedged in a crevice between rocks, 50 yards north of where Weatherby's body had washed up. Just a scrap of paper, water-stained and torn, but with a few legible words. Cannot continue to ignore. Pierce knows. Danger if exposed. The keeper's hands shook slightly as he held it. This changed everything. And nothing. It was evidence of something, but evidence so fragmentary it proved nothing. Who had written it? To whom? When? The paper could have been there for months, unrelated to Weatherby entirely. Except he knew it was related. The way you know a storm is coming by the quality of the light and the smell of the air. He took the fragment back to the lighthouse, dried it carefully, and placed it between the pages of his logbook. Then he sat at his small desk and thought hard about what to do next. The smart thing was to burn it and forget he had ever seen it. Weatherby was dead. The investigation was closed. Whatever corrupt business was happening in the harbor, and he was now certain something corrupt was indeed happening, was not his concern. His job was to keep the light burning. Period. But the old keeper's other lesson echoed too. You keep the logbook honest. You record the truth, even when it's inconvenient. He started a second logbook, private and unofficial. In it, he began recording observations. Ships that passed at night without lights. Unusual activity at certain warehouses. Comments he overheard in the village when people forgot he was there. Names that came up repeatedly in connection with shipping. Pierce, obviously. Sheriff Morrison. 3 or 4 merchants whose businesses seemed too prosperous given the economic times. He was careful, methodical, patient. He asked no direct questions. He simply watched and listened, and wrote it all down in careful script, hiding the book in a gap behind a loose stone in the lighthouse wall. March brought the anniversary of the old keeper's death, and also the first hints of spring. The ice began to break up, shipping traffic increased, and the keeper, now 31 years old, realized he had crossed some invisible boundary. He was no longer simply doing his job. He was investigating a murder that no one else believed was a murder. The thought should have frightened him. Instead, it brought a strange clarity. For the first time in years, he felt like he was doing something that mattered beyond routine maintenance and careful record-keeping. Weatherby had died trying to expose corruption. Someone had to finish what he started, even if that someone was just a solitary lighthouse keeper with no authority, no allies, and no illusions about how dangerous powerful men could be when threatened. The light burned every night, steady and true. And in its keeper's private log, the truth was slowly, carefully, being assembled from fragments and shadows, and the small inconsistencies that most people overlooked. Storms would come. He would weather them. That was what keepers did. Spring arrived with mud and fog and the return of possibility. The keeper had learned patience from the sea itself, how to watch without appearing to watch, how to wait for the right moment, how to let information come to him rather than chasing it. He went about his duties as always, the reliable keeper who kept to himself and bothered no one. Beneath this surface, his private investigation grew like roots spreading through rock. The village had a rhythm he had never fully noticed before. Certain ships arrived on certain days. Certain cargo disappeared into certain warehouses. Patterns emerged when you paid attention over weeks and months rather than days. A schooner called the Mercy Ann came twice monthly, always at night, always mooring in the deeper water past the main docks. Its manifest listed general goods, but the keeper watched through his telescope as men unloaded crates that moved with the careful weight of something valuable. Tobacco, probably. Possibly spirits. Definitely untaxed. He wrote it all down in his hidden log, dating each observation, noting weather conditions, and which men were involved in the unloading. Pierce was often present, supervising. So was a merchant named Dalton, who owned the largest warehouse. Sometimes Sheriff Morrison appeared, standing watch but never actually helping with the cargo. The keeper made no accusations in his log, just recorded facts. Facts were defensible. Speculation was dangerous. He varied his trips to the village, going at different times, taking different routes when possible. At the general store, he cultivated his reputation as a man of few words but many ears. Margaret eventually resumed her natural chattiness around him, apparently deciding he was too odd and solitary to be a threat. "Did you hear about the Caldwell brothers?" she asked one afternoon while measuring out his flour. "Lost their fishing boat last month. Just vanished. They're saying it was a storm, but there wasn't any storm that night." "Maybe they sailed south, looking for work." "Maybe. Or maybe they saw something they shouldn't have." She glanced around, though the store was empty. "Jake Caldwell once told my nephew that the night fishing wasn't natural. All those boats going out with no lights. Said it felt wrong." The keeper kept his expression neutral. "People see what they want to see in the dark." "True enough." But Margaret's look suggested she knew more than she was saying. He began talking to old Jacob, a fisherman too aged for regular work, who spent his days mending nets on the dock. Jacob had been fishing these waters for 50 years and had the kind of knowledge that came from decades of observation. "You ever notice anything unusual about shipping patterns?" the keeper asked one day, helping untangle a fouled line. Jacob's gnarled hands never stopped moving. "Unusual how? Ships coming and going at odd times? Cargo that doesn't match the manifests?" The old man was quiet for a long moment. "A man who asks questions like that is either brave or foolish." "Probably foolish." "Probably." Jacob secured a knot with practiced efficiency. "There's things that happen in harbors that have always happened. Merchants avoiding tariffs, goods coming in that maybe shouldn't. It's the way of the world. Smart folk don't notice." "And Mr. Weatherby? Was he smart folk?" Jacob's hands stilled. When he spoke again, his voice was very low. "Tom Weatherby was honest. In a business where honest men don't survive long. You understand what I'm saying?" "I think so." "Good. Then stop asking questions before you end up honest too." The keeper took this advice with the seriousness it deserved, but he did not stop. He simply became more careful. In June, he made a discovery that shifted everything. He was in town picking up lamp oil when he saw Deputy Ellis coming out of the harbor master's office, looking troubled. The young deputy walked past without seeing him, muttering to himself. The keeper followed at a distance, curious. Ellis went to the small office he kept behind the jail, a room barely large enough for a desk and filing cabinet. Through the window, the keeper watched him pull out a folder and page through it with increasing agitation. Then Ellis did something interesting. He copied several pages by hand, folded them carefully, and tucked them inside his coat. The keeper filed this observation away and went back to his lighthouse. 2 days later, Ellis appeared on the path, carrying the usual mail delivery. But after handing over the letters, he lingered. "Hell of a fog coming in," Ellis said, looking at the gray wall advancing across the water. "Always does this time of year. Must be difficult, keeping that lamp visible through fog like that." "It's what the lamp is for," Ellis nodded, shifted his weight, started to leave, then turned back. "Can I ask you something, off the record?" The keeper felt his pulse quicken, but kept his voice level. "You can ask." "Did Mr. Weatherby ever talk to you about irregularities in shipping records?" So there it was. The keeper chose his words carefully. "He mentioned once that manifests sometimes contained errors. I assumed he meant honest mistakes." "Right, of course." Ellis looked out at the fog. "The thing is, I've been going through old records. Deaths along this coast over the past decade. There's been 7 drownings ruled accidental. All of them were men who worked in shipping or fishing. And all of them happened within a year of filing complaints about irregularities." The keeper said nothing, letting the silence stretch. "I showed the records to Sheriff Morrison. He said I was wasting time, seeing patterns where there weren't any. Said drownings happen all the time in a fishing community. Told me to focus on actual crimes." Ellis's jaw tightened. "Maybe he's right. Maybe I'm being foolish. Or maybe you're being brave." Ellis looked at him sharply. "I could lose my position." "You could. But if I'm right, and I do nothing," he stopped, shook his head. "I don't know why I'm telling you this. You're a lighthouse keeper, not an investigator." Lighthouse keepers are good at watching, though, at noticing things most people miss. Something passed between them, an understanding neither put into words. Ellis pulled out the folded papers from inside his coat. "These are copies of shipping records that don't quite add up. Cargo values that seem wrong. Ships arriving, but no corresponding customs payments. I can't do anything with them. I'm too junior, and Morrison would bury me for going behind his back. But maybe..." He hesitated. "Maybe someone with federal authority might be interested." The keeper took the papers, unfolded them, scanned the columns of figures and dates. His mind raced ahead, seeing connections, patterns. "There's a federal revenue agent in Portland," Ellis said quietly. "Name's Cutler. He's been investigating smuggling operations up and down the coast. If someone were to send him information anonymously, he might look into it." "That's a dangerous game." "Yes," Ellis met his eyes. "But some games need playing." After Ellis left, the keeper spent the evening studying the copied records. They painted a clear picture once you knew how to read them. Ships declaring low-value cargo but paying dock fees appropriate for much larger shipments. Multiple vessels, owned by different companies, but all using the same agent, Pierce. Payments flowing through accounts that disappeared into a web of false names and empty businesses. It was sophisticated, organized, and involved at least a dozen men in positions of authority. No wonder Weatherby's questions had made him a target. No wonder the investigation into his death had been closed so quickly.
The keeper sat at his desk and began writing a letter. He kept it factual, detailed, and devoid of speculation. Just observations and dates and the documents Ellis had provided. He signed it only with his position, lighthouse keeper, Cape Station, and included no return address. He mailed it from a town 20 miles south during his next leave day, taking the coast road and posting it at a general store where no one knew him. Then he went back to his lighthouse and waited. In August, he noticed he was being watched.
Nothing obvious, but he had lived alone long enough to sense when the solitude was interrupted. A man lurking near the supply shed who disappeared when approached. Footprints in the sand that were not his own. The sense, returning to the lighthouse after an errand, that someone had been inside though nothing was disturbed. His private log remained safely hidden, but the message was clear. Someone suspected he was not simply a keeper minding his own business. He became more cautious, varying his routines, checking locks, sleeping lighter. The paranoia felt justified when he discovered the lamp oil had been contaminated with water, enough to foul the wick, but not enough to be obvious sabotage. He reported it as an accident, ordered new oil, and said nothing about his suspicions. In September, something shifted. Ships that usually arrived like clockwork stopped coming. The Mercy Ann disappeared from the harbor entirely. Pierce looked haggard, distracted. Sheriff Morrison started spending more time at the harbormaster's office. The keeper sensed the investigation tightening like a net, though he heard nothing official. Ellis stopped by once, said nothing of importance, but gave him a small nod that conveyed volumes. October brought storms and the first hard frost. The keeper maintained his light, kept his records, and waited for whatever was coming. He had set things in motion that could not be stopped. The truth, once released, had its own momentum. He thought often of Weatherby, drowned and discarded, his questions silenced. But the questions themselves remained, growing louder in the silence. Some lights kept burning, not despite the darkness, but because of it. The wind that winter had a voice, low and constant, like someone whispering secrets outside the lighthouse walls. The keeper had grown used to isolation, but this was different. The quiet now carried weight, the tension of forces unseen gathering. The signs of scrutiny became unmistakable. A supply shipment delayed with no explanation. A replacement wick order returned as lost in transit. The inspector from the lighthouse board, usually cordial, arrived abrupt and officious, checking every ledger, every gallon of oil, questioning every minor discrepancy. He left satisfied enough, but his eyes had betrayed another task, one that had nothing to do with lighthouse maintenance. The message was clear. He was being watched from higher places, too. He had learned long ago that fear didn't announce itself with panic, but crept in with habits. He started locking the door even during the day, writing his private entries only at night, by dim lamp glow in cramped handwriting. The journal beneath the loose stone grew heavier week by week, inked evidence of other people's sins. One evening, while inspecting the northern fence where the sea salt ate at the wood, he found a dead gull with its neck broken cleanly rather than twisted by the wind. Tied to its leg, a small scrap of parchment. Keep your eyes on the light, not the shore. No signature, not even the dignity of threat, only warning turned mockery. He buried the bird in the sand and went back to work, forcing the gesture to mean nothing. But that night, while trimming the lamp, he could not shake the sound of the old keeper's voice. Men with authority are not your friends. A week later, Deputy Ellis returned under pretense of meteorological record-keeping. The temperature had dropped below freezing and ice crusted the shore. His hands shook, not from the cold, the keeper decided, but from the weight of something dangerous. "They know someone's been sending information," Ellis said quietly, standing near the lamp's base, steam rising from his breath. "Cutler's in Portland, pushing arrests. They're looking for the source." "And you?" "I'm pretending I don't know."
It's harder than it sounds.
"You shouldn't come here anymore. If I stop coming, that'll tell them more than staying. Besides," he hesitated, glancing up the spiral where the light's slow rotation brushed the stone with pale fire. "You started it. I can't just stand aside now." The keeper said nothing for a long time. "Then be careful what you start believing. Truth doesn't protect you. It only names what endangers you." Ellis nodded once, bowed his head as though in reluctant agreement, and left soon after, boots crunching heavy in the snow. The nights grew longer. The investigations elsewhere deepened. Word reached the village that a customs official in Portland had been arrested. Another merchant vanished discreetly on a supposed trip to Boston and never arrived. The newspapers made only vague mention of fraudulent shipping activities, but for anyone living along the coast, it was clear that something large was unraveling. Gideon Pierce, once omnipresent, had become rare in public. When he did appear, he carried visible strain, a hardness about the eyes, impatience bleeding through his perfumed civility. The keeper saw him once in January, striding along the pier, coat collar up, speaking in hushed tones with the sheriff. Pierce's hand gestured toward the sea, then toward the lighthouse, and for a moment the keeper felt sure they were speaking of him. A colder fear stalked him that month. What if they suspected the truth, but couldn't prove it? If they thought him a threat without being entirely certain, he might simply vanish into some unrecorded accident. Enough ice, enough fog, a fall from the gallery, perfectly plausible. Near the end of February, the keeper discovered the lamp's oil completely fouled, half water again, half waste. This time he caught the sign of tampering. A faint scuff mark near the door, footprints not his own, the smell of tobacco lingering where he never smoked. Whoever entered the tower was comfortable doing so. He stood that night beside the lamp as the wind screamed, and the light cut through fog like a blade. The storm mirrored his thoughts, fierce, formless, all noise and obscured edges. He kept the lamp burning by sheer will, knowing that failure would mean precisely what his enemies wanted. In early March, he went to the village for provisions and found Rachel Weatherby in the chandlery, veiled, speaking softly with Margaret. Grief had refined her into a sharper form, no longer the merchant's pretty wife, but a woman with purpose. When she saw him, something like recognition flickered, the unspoken bond of shared loss. "I have something," she said when Margaret turned away. "Something my husband hid." He followed her down a side street to her small rented house. Inside, she unwrapped a bundle wrapped in old sailcloth, a leather-bound ledger, water-stained, its spine fraying. Inside, meticulous entries in Weatherby's handwriting. Names, shipments, payment sums, initials beside transactions that clearly violated every smuggling statute in the book. Pierce appeared again and again, tied to every illicit arrival. Even the sheriff's initials marked alongside certain entries marked enforcement cover. Rachel's eyes were steady. He left it behind a beam in our old warehouse. I went there last week. I think he meant for someone to find it after. Why give this to me? Because Thomas said once you were the only honest man he'd met on this coast. He said if anything happened, you'd know what to do with the truth. He took the ledger. You realize what happens if they know you still have this? I've already lost everything, she said simply. That night he sealed the ledger in oilcloth and hid it beneath the floorboards of the service room, behind the spare lamp assembly. The weight of it felt like ballast, dangerous but necessary to stay upright. In April came a letter, unsigned but bearing a government seal. It contained only a line, hand-penned. Investigation proceeding. Your materials received. Expect contact soon. No request for further proof, no acknowledgement of danger, just that cold reassurance of official hands. He burned the note after reading it 3 times. In May, a stranger arrived. Middle-aged, solid frame, eyes sharp but kind. He introduced himself as Mr. Cutler, speaking softly, asking to see the lamp system as part of regional efficiency review. The keeper played his part, showed him the wick, the prisms, the log. When they reached the top, Cutler lowered his voice. You've done more than your duty. Federal warrants are being prepared. Don't trust anyone from the harbor. When action comes, it'll come fast. Then it comes late, the keeper said. You've kept a light burning few others would dare tend. Cutler's look conveyed understanding that required no words. He departed by rowboat just before sunset. The keeper watched the vessel diminish across the gray water, leaving the horizon bare again. Summer crept in, humid and tense. Villagers whispered less. Even Margaret's gossip dried up. A single rumor slipped through one afternoon. The harbor master's ledgers had gone missing. Someone had broken into his office before dawn. Pierce was offering a reward for information. The keeper feared it might point toward Ellis, but the young deputy remained outwardly calm, continuing his rounds between lighthouse and village. In July, during one such visit, Ellis confessed in a low voice, "The arrests are imminent. Pierce knows it. He's desperate." And desperation was dangerous. 2 nights later, heavy fog rolled in from the sea. The lighthouse bell clanged slow and hollow. Somewhere below, oars splashed. The keeper descended, lamp in hand, every sense alert. He caught the echo of boots on the path and froze. Shadows moved at the edge of light. 2, maybe 3 men. Pierce's voice carried thin through the mist. "You've made quite a nuisance of yourself, boy. Government's pet. They'll forget you soon enough." The keeper backed toward the doorway, heart hammering. "It's too late for threats." "Nothing's too late at sea," Pierce answered. Another step forward, metallic glint of a pistol under the man's coat. But then a shout, Ellis's voice, close and urgent. "Federal men in the harbor! Cutler's here!" The figures dissolved into the fog as if swallowed by it. The keeper ran to the cliff edge, saw lanterns bobbing along the shore, boats pulling in fast, men calling orders. Sirens in the distance, unheard along this coast for decades. By dawn, the harbor blazed with torches and voices of authority. Pierce was arrested trying to flee south by schooner. Morrison taken in his own office. Merchant Dalton found dead 2 days later, an apparent suicide. The smuggling chain unraveled with sudden completeness. years of rot exposed to salt and daylight. The keeper remained apart from it all, silent observer once more. Ellis came to him, face pale but eyes bright. "It's done," he said simply. "They're finished." "Nothing's ever finished," the keeper replied. "It only changes hands." Ellis looked out toward the horizon. "Maybe, but this time someone honest gets to keep the light." The keeper felt the truth of that settle deep in him. Not triumph, not even relief, just an even kind of peace born from endurance. He returned to his tower, to his lens and oil, his worn log. Outside, the sea murmured under sunlight, patient as ever. He trimmed the wick, watched the flame steady, then turned toward the spiral stair. Below, the world was shifting in ways beyond his control. But up here, the light was constant. It always had been. The air after the arrests felt different, not cleaner, just emptied, like a room after a quarrel where the dust hung thick but no one spoke. The village went about its business, pretending life had returned to normal, as though smuggling and murder were inconveniences best kept off the record. But under that polite surface ran unease. Long-held alliances had crumbled, and the sea carried whispers better than the wind. The keeper resumed his duty, though his hands, when trimming the wick, had a faint tremor, not from fear, but from a strange, weary relief. The light burned steady, uninvolved, while on shore the world tried to decide what justice looked like. In June, letters arrived on heavy paper bearing federal seal. One congratulated him on significant assistance in an ongoing investigation concerning contraband shipments through coastal Maine. Another, more practical, informed him that federal officers would be visiting to collect final testimony. He stored both in his trunk beneath the old pocket watch. Cutler returned on a clear morning, his manner brisk but kind. He brought with him Ellis, promoted now, shoulders squared under a newer coat. The meeting took place in the keeper's quarters, coffee steaming in tin mugs. "It's over," Cutler said. "Pierce and his accomplices are in custody. Court sessions to start this autumn. The evidence you preserved will be critical. You'll receive formal acknowledgement from Washington." The keeper nodded, unsure what acknowledgement meant to a man who measured his life in tides and lamp oil. Cutler studied him. "You should be proud." "I'm alive, that's enough." Ellis smiled faintly. "You're more famous than you think. Half the coast whispers about the keeper who unmasked the harbor thieves. Then half the coast will forget by winter. People like forgetting uncomfortable truths." Cutler chuckled quietly. "Then may time grant you comfort." When they left, the keeper stood in the doorway watching the small boat pull away, cutting white trails across still water. The sea glimmered as if nothing had happened at all. Through summer, ships passed safely under the lighthouse's beam. The trade routes slowly revived, new merchants taking over warehouses stripped of their former owners. The streets in the village grew cautiously lively again. Sometimes he went into town for supplies and caught fragments of conversation. Disbelief about Pierce's fall, sympathy for the widows, complaint about federal interference. No one mentioned him directly, but he felt their glances, part gratitude, part suspicion. There were fewer visits from friendly faces now. Even Ellis, busy in new duties, stopped appearing so often. The solitude deepened in its familiar way, less isolation now than returning habit. He mended what needed mending, recorded tides, cleaned the windows until the glass shone clear. The lamp became again his sole companion. One damp morning, Rachel Weatherby came up the path. She carried herself differently, grief still visible, but steadied into something quiet and resolved. "I heard the hearings will be in Portland," she said. "Yes." "They asked me to testify. I suppose that makes sense. I found the ledger." He nodded. "It matters that you do." "I don't sleep well," she added after a pause, "when storms come. It feels the same as that night." "You get used to the sound," he said softly. "It's only wind. It only feels like memory." Rachel looked up at the tower and smiled a little. "My husband used to say truth is like light. It doesn't choose whom to shine on. Thank you for helping prove him right." After she left, he stood a long time at the gallery, watching her figure grow small against the rocks. He wondered if truth ever really illuminated, or if it simply drew attention to the cracks in everything else. In September, he received summons to testify in Portland. His name stood printed officially beside titles of other witnesses, customs officers, merchants, laborers. The hearing hall, when he arrived, smelled of salt and ink. He spoke quietly, answering each question precisely, never volunteering more than asked. Facts only: the body, the bruises, the letters, the ledgers. The courtroom murmured when Pierce's name reappeared like a ghost across multiple testimonies. Pierce himself was there, sitting pale and thinner than the man the keeper remembered. When their eyes met across the chamber, recognition passed briefly, something between contempt and regret. Pierce looked away first. Weeks of proceedings stretched, and one evening the keeper found Ellis waiting by the dock where he lodged during the hearings. "They'll convict him," Ellis said. "Do you believe that means justice?" "I'm young enough to still think so," Ellis replied, and smiled wryly. They parted on the pier, fog beginning to form low over the water. The keeper watched the young man vanish into mist, lantern bobbing like a star struggling to stay alight. By October, verdicts came. Pierce sentenced to years in a federal prison. Others fined, dismissed, reprimanded. The newspapers printed columns about the moral reconstruction of maritime commerce. And then, predictably, other stories replaced them. The keeper returned home to the peninsula, to the tower that waited unchanged. The sea had already reclaimed the memory of scandal. Life resumed its measured cadence, the lamp relit, the journal maintained, foghorn echoing across nights thick with silence. But he felt older than the passing years could explain, like stone worn smooth by constant weather. Winter came harshly early that year. Ice crusted at the edges of the lantern panes, and the mechanism groaned under the cold. He worked through it, sometimes with numb fingers, sometimes with thoughts drifting to those caught inside Portland's prison walls. Once he dreamed of Pierce standing beneath the rotating lens, the light cutting his face in shifting halves of brightness and shadow. There were new faces at sea by then, fresh captains, unfamiliar flags. Once, a young sailor waved upward from a deck as his ship passed close. Instinct made the keeper raise his hand in return. He wondered how many men below knew that a single light turned above them out of habit, out of duty, out of something too wordless to name. In January, Ellis made the long ride out to see him again. Snow clung to his boots as he stamped it from the entryway, laughing.
They offered you another post, Ellis said. Further south, bigger harbor, better pay. I declined. Of course you did, Ellis said, warming his hands by the small stove. You belong here. The keeper poured coffee. They sat silently a while, listening to the low moan of winter wind around the tower. You ever think about it? Ellis asked suddenly.
Everything that happened? Sometimes, the keeper said, but mostly I think about the next storm. It's simpler. Ellis considered that. Simplicity's worth envy these days. When the deputy departed, leaving tracks across frozen ground, the keeper climbed the spiral stair to the lantern room. The sunset had faded to iron gray. The sea was a sheet of motionless metal. He lit the wick, adjusted the focus until the lens caught the flame and multiplied it into brilliance. The mechanism hummed to life, slow, unyielding. A fresh storm was rising far off, the horizon pulsing faintly with lightning. He stayed there long after his duty ended, watching the light sweep across empty water. Somewhere beyond his sight, ships prepared for nightfall, sailors checking their bearings against the steady pulse from his tower. He thought about fear, about courage, about the thin divide between them. And he understood, as keepers must, that some lights divide more than darkness. They divide past from future, loss from endurance. When men of power fall, the world readjusts itself quietly, one steady rotation at a time. The storm finally reached him near dawn, battering glass and stone, but the lamp did not falter. It never did. Spring came shivering up the coast, dragging color back into the gray. Where months of ice had ruled, rivers now ran quick and bright. For the keeper, the changing season hardly altered his rhythm. He still woke before dawn, still kept the logs precise, still cared for the lamp as if it were breath itself. Yet something in him shifted with the thaw. The air no longer smelled of danger, only salt and distance. News traveled slowly, as always. Word reached the peninsula that the trials had concluded, Pierce sentenced, the remaining smugglers imprisoned or fined beyond ruin. The scandal had burned through the winter like a slow fever. Now only a handful of names lingered on people's tongues, mostly whispered as caution. Greed and tide, they said, will both drown a man who thinks himself stronger than either. Ellis came up one morning astride a borrowed horse, his new uniform dark against the pale dawn. He had been made full sheriff now, younger than any before him, promoted for courage and clarity. Justice, the papers called it. The keeper poured coffee into tin cups while the gale murmured faintly outside. They're gone, Ellis said simply. Every last one accounted for. Federal men finished their work. It's quiet again. Quiet's overrated, the keeper said, though his tone carried no humor. It lets you hear yourself too well. Ellis smiled at that. They asked me to tell you, the department wishes to commend your evidence formally. There'll be a certificate, a pension supplement, some gesture. The keeper raised an eyebrow. Paper thanks for doing what conscience required. That's more than most men do. They drank in silence for a while. Then Ellis, looking down into his half-empty cup, said, "Do you ever think about him, Pierce?" The keeper nodded. Sometimes. He thought himself untouchable. Maybe that's the only kind of blindness worth pity. Maybe it's the kind that built every empire, Ellis murmured. The sea cracked against rocks below as if in agreement. The lighthouse needed new paint that spring, so the keeper set to work. He scaled the scaffolding alone, brush in one hand, tar-sweet air filling his lungs.
Seabirds circled, startled by his presence, their calls echoing through the mist. While working, his mind wandered back to the old keeper, the lessons spoken between long silences, the quiet decency of a life devoted to a task others seldom noticed. Those lessons had guarded him through darker seasons. He felt the weight of gratitude, and something close to loneliness wrapped inside.
The villagers began visiting again, cautiously polite. Children dared each other to run up the path, laughing until their voices vanished in the wind. Their parents offered nods of respect, though none lingered long. People remembered his role but seemed unsure whether to treat him as hero or reminder. Neither sat comfortably with him, so he accepted both with the same quiet nod. By midsummer, changes came from the service department. The board sent word that every major lighthouse along the coast was to take on an apprentice, guaranteeing continuity when older keepers retired. A boy from the village arrived, barely 16, broad-shouldered, eager-eyed, smelling faintly of rope tar. His name was Hugh. The keeper greeted him with reserved curiosity. "You good with your hands?" "Yes, sir," the boy answered. "Then use them, and watch while you do." Hugh learned quickly. He mended the wicks with care, charted barometric readings, and asked endless questions about storms and ships. At times his energy grated, but it warmed the tower in a way silence had not managed all winter. The keeper saw in him the same thin mix of hope and fear he had carried years before. Training him became less duty, more continuation, the same flame passed onward. One evening, as they watched dusk melt into the sea, the boy said, "Is it true you're the one who caught the smugglers?" "Caught?" The keeper smiled faintly. "No. Light only shows what's already there. The rest was their doing." "But people say many things. Only the sea tells the same story twice." The boy frowned, then nodded, sensing that further questions would cheapen the truth. By autumn, the tower stood radiant in renewed whitewash, the brass fittings polished to mirror shine. Ships passed under the steady beam each night, and sometimes captains sent letters of thanks, survivors from storms who claimed the light saved them. The keeper accepted these with quiet satisfaction, but rarely replied. His satisfaction was not in acknowledgement, but in function, the lamp burning as intended. He heard little more about Pierce after the sentencing notices. The harbor master transferred to a distant prison inland where sea smells could never reach him. Rumor had it he spent his days pacing the courtyard, muttering names that no longer mattered. The keeper imagined him under gray stone skies, stripped of all that had once given him authority. He felt no triumph, only recognition. Even a man like Pierce believed he was guarding something valuable. It was ambition that twisted that sense of duty into greed. In early winter, as the first heavy storm of the season approached, the keeper prepared through the night, teaching Hugh how to brace for gales that could lash for days. They secured shutters, checked oil drums, tied ropes against wind pressure. The storm struck at dawn, fierce, unrelenting, hammering against the tower like a living creature. Foam collided with glass, and gusts howled through every seam. The keeper stayed wakeful beside the lamp, guiding the rotation, ensuring flame stability. He caught himself remembering another storm long ago, the night Weatherby's body washed ashore. The sea outside roared the same, but the sound reached him differently now. He felt pity rather than fear, and a kind of reverence for the cycles that made men small and humble. Somewhere in the gale, Hugh shouted over the noise, "Why do you never leave this place?" The keeper smiled, water running from his hair. "Because someone must keep it lit. That's the whole trick of life. Hold the light until someone else can see it." The boy nodded, not quite understanding, but remembering all the same. By morning, the wind died. The gray world shimmered under frost. The lighthouse had held firm, just as it always had. The keeper walked to the shore once weather allowed, surveying debris scattered along the tide line, pieces of fishing crates, a broken mast, seaweed twisted into knots. Amid it all, a tarnished brass chain gleamed faintly. He picked it up, a signet ring still attached. The crest engraved had been worn smooth by salt, but he recognized its shape. Weatherby's ring. After all these years, the sea had given it back. He cleaned it carefully and placed it inside his trunk beside the old pocket watch. Both belonged to men whose light had guided his path in different ways. That evening he sat writing in his log, the final pages filling slowly. He recorded the weather, the damage reports, the condition of the lamp. Then, below the official entries, he wrote a single line that did not belong to duty. "The light endures, as do those who choose to guard it." Outside, the horizon fell into darkness. The beam swept across endless water, touching nothing, yet reaching everything, indifferent and benevolent all at once. Hugh slept downstairs, worn from the storm. The keepers stared at the revolving glow, listening to its endless rhythm. The years of fear and suspicion, of corruption and storm, felt distant now, like another man's story whispered through wind. But it had shaped him, carved meaning from solitude, and left him standing, unchosen, unheralded, and wholly alive. The lantern's wheel turned once more, slow and absolute, marking the hour. Somewhere far offshore, a bell buoy rang faint and sure. He drew his coat tighter, stepped out into the gallery air, and looked toward the open sea, calm at last. The light moved over the water, slow as breath, and somewhere beneath that quiet shimmer lay every answer he'd ever sought. Spring drifted back to the coast almost shyly, softening the harsh edges left behind by winter storms. The ice retreated from the coves, revealing smooth stones and tangled heaps of seaweed bleached by salt. Gulls returned, loud and demanding, as they always did. For the lighthouse keeper, this season felt different. Not another turning of the same cycle, but a kind of release. The years of turmoil had passed. The secrets that once festered beneath the surface lay buried or confessed. The sea's memory, long and impartial, had already begun to wash them away. He had grown older, though not by count of years alone. The lines around his eyes spoke of salt and solitude more than time. Still, he moved with quiet precision, his steps sure along the spiral stair. The lamp turned, imperceptible in its patience, cutting the twilight with the same measured rhythm it had since he was a boy. Hugh, the apprentice, had taken over much of the labor now. He carried buckets of oil, logged the weather reports, climbed the stairs 2 at a time. His optimism was contagious, and the keeper often found himself smiling at the boy's enthusiasm. Watching Hugh reminded him of what had once been, when a child from the village first saw in this tower a kind of promise rather than confinement. One evening they sat outside near the base of the tower, eating salted cod and bread, the sea calm as glass. "Will you stay here all your life?" Hugh asked suddenly. The keeper chewed thoughtfully. "I thought I would. For a long time there wasn't anywhere else. And now I don't think about leaving or staying. I think about the light. So long as it's tended, the rest doesn't matter much." The boy considered this as gulls cried overhead. "I think I understand." "You don't," the keeper said gently, "but you will." The sun slipped behind the horizon, and Hugh went to light the lamp. The keeper watched as the flame bloomed, steadying under the glass. Its glow touched the tower walls with gold before becoming a bright pulse over the sea. In that moment, he realized how natural it had become to see the work passed on, to trust that the light would continue after his hands no longer kindled it. The following weeks unfolded quietly. Repairs were minor, storms light. The federal inspectors came and went with their ledgers and formal nods, leaving behind a sense of bureaucratic order that barely brushed the daily rhythm of the station. Letters came, occasionally. Ellis wrote from Portland, now working along a wider stretch of coast. Rachel Weatherby sent one too, short and tender. "The children are grown. The sea is still cruel, but not always unkind." Her handwriting had steadied. Grief had matured into peace. He kept both letters folded inside the old lighthouse log. Most mornings he rose before dawn and stepped outside to breathe the ocean air before beginning the day's tasks. The world felt strangely smaller now, yet somehow also kinder. The villagers waved when they passed the headland. Some stopped to trade fish or small bundles of herbs. Their suspicion had faded into gratitude, or at least respect. He was no longer the odd keeper on the rocks, but something larger, part of the coast itself, as constant as tide or wind. Yet solitude remained his truest companion. It was not loneliness anymore, but habit, a familiar friend that walked beside him in silence. When memories came, they came without ache. The old keeper's slow smile, Weatherby's earnest conversations, Ellis's determined eyes. Even Pierce appeared sometimes in dream, not as an enemy, but as a man undone by pride and hunger. Every life left its own current, he thought, and all currents returned to the same sea. The lighthouse clock ticked steadily through summer nights. Sometimes Hugh would doze against the wall while the keeper wrote neat lines in the logbook. Wind from southwest, visibility clear, light running perfectly. The sound of the waves below lulled him, a rhythm older than human thought. One night near midsummer, unexpected fog crept in, dense, rolling, alive. It swallowed the coastline, the reefs, the stars. The foghorn bellowed at intervals, a lonely sound that trembled through glass and bone. The keeper climbed the stairs, oil can in hand, finding Hugh already there beside the lamp, eyes wide. The light sliced through fog like a blade, but could not pierce it far. The sea disappeared entirely. The keeper rested a hand on the boy's shoulder. "There'll be ships out there tonight, blind as bats. This is when the work matters most." They kept watch together, adjusting the beam, tending the flame. The tower stood firm as wind moaned around it. Some time before dawn, the faint toll of a bell echoed across the fog,
a ship's buoy or a warning bell from a vessel feeling its way through the mist. The sound faded, then returned, stronger. Another strike of foghorns answered it down the coast. Hugh's face lit with awe. "We guided them, didn't we?" "Maybe."
Or reminded them the world still holds shape, even when you can't see it. When morning came, the fog thinned to mist, and faint outlines of masts appeared offshore. The keeper watched them pass safely toward open water. He exhaled a slow breath, aware that the heart, too, needs its signals of certainty. That autumn, on his 39th year, he began to think of what came next, not with dread, but curiosity. His health was strong, though the climbs left him winded now. Occasionally, he imagined himself living in one of the small cottages inland, perhaps near the harbor, where he could hear the waves without seeing them. Maybe he'd carve model ships, repair nets, teach weather signs to those who still believed clouds spoke truth. Or maybe he'd simply sit by the sea each evening, watching his successor's light sweep the horizon. One evening, near the end of the season, townsfolk gathered to dedicate a new buoy installed by federal order. Ellis had returned for the ceremony, older now, the sharpness in his face softened by experience. He sought the keeper afterward among the crowd. "They say there's talk of upgrading the light with new lenses next year," Ellis said. "Modern improvements, they call it." The keeper smiled slightly. "Progress has its own lantern. It burns faster, but not always brighter." Ellis studied him. "And you? Will you stay?" "For a while. Long enough to make sure the boy doesn't mistake routine for faith." They walked in silence to the harbor wall. The tide was rising, the evening calm. "You did more than keep ships from wrecking," Ellis said finally. "You kept this coast honest." The keeper looked out where the setting sun struck gold across the sea. "Then honesty must be like light too. No man's forever. It only passes through us." That night he returned to the tower and lingered before lighting the lamp. The sea was almost still, reflecting stars in its calm skin. When the flame caught, it glowed soft at first, then sharpened, steady and sure. He watched its rotation sweep outward, each pass cutting through darkness. Below, Hugh prepared logs and charts, careful now, confident. He descended the stair slowly, his palm against the cool railing polished by years of use. Every step echoed faintly, the sound of a life measured not in years, but in turns of the light. In the quarters, he poured a measure of brandy, sat by the window, and listened to the steady heartbeat of the mechanism above. The ocean murmured beyond the glass. The fog bell chimed once. Somewhere, though invisible, people slept safely on ships gliding toward morning. He closed his eyes and smiled. The flame upstairs kept its rhythm. It would be tended. It would endure. The sea outside breathed in, breathed out. The lighthouse stood, solid, waiting, and utterly alive. The night pressed close, not oppressive, but gentle, like the quiet after prayer. The world had moved on without him, and still he belonged entirely within it. The light continued.